Michael Mikowski. Yep. Let me try that again. Hi, this is Michael Mikowski, President and CEO of GINSA. Welcome, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining us. We're honored today to have with us General Frank McKenzie, a Marine who was in the military for a number of decades. With his last position was commander of the U.S. Central Command, from which he stepped down and retired from the military in 2022. He is now serves as the executive director of the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. He also is soon going to be publishing a book entitled "The Melting Point: High Command and War in the 21st Century," which I hope at the end of this General we could discuss a little bit. He also participated in GINSA's 2022 Generals and Admirals program trip to Israel. He has a long biography, a very distinguished career, obviously noted for many military achievements, such as as he was the CENTCOM commander during the killing of the ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, also the IRGC Al-Quds commander General Qasem Soleimani, and of course was also the commander of CENTCOM during our withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. Obviously has a long list of military achievements. Very accomplished general. Thank you very much, General McKenzie, for joining us.
Michael, I'm glad to be with you this afternoon.
Okay, look, I want to start. Obviously, we're here to talk about countering Iranian aggression, and I think I commend our audience, if they haven't read it, to please do so, because I'm going to start asking you questions off it. But your piece in the Wall Street Journal from last week, I think it appeared online on January 4th, but appeared in the print publication of the Journal on January 5th. And it's entitled by the Journal, "Lesson of the Strike That Killed Soleimani." And I want to quote the conclusion you have and ask you off of that. Look, as you know, well, let me just say it for the audience, because I know certainly the General knows this. The U.S. forces have been attacked, let's say, since 2021 by Iran-backed proxies in Iraq and Syria until October 7th. There were some like 80 or 90 attacks on U.S. forces. I believe we retaliated about 4 times since October 7th, when Hamas invaded Israel and committed all those atrocities and triggered the current Gaza war. There have been about 120 attacks that we count on U.S. forces by Iran or its proxies in the region, and I think we've retaliated about 7 times. And you say, and I'm going to quote the concluding paragraph in your Wall Street Journal op-ed: "Unfortunately, is the U.S. that is being deterred, not Iran and its proxies. To reset deterrence, we must supply violence that Tehran understands. Paradoxically, if done earlier, this violence could have been of a far smaller, more measured scale. Indecision has placed us in this position. There's a way forward, but it requires the U.S. to set aside the fear of escalation and act according to the priorities of our strategic documents and concepts. Iranians understand steel. They also understand mush. It is time to choose." So let me unpack some of this. Before I ask you what you think we should be doing, how do you explain what we're not doing? That obviously in your piece, which again I thought was really superb, you argue that the U.S. should be retaliating for these attacks to deter future attacks, and you say we're the ones that are being deterred. Why do you think that is?
Well, Michael, first of all, I'm happy to be with you here today. These are important subjects, and I look forward to the discussion we're going to have. I think we have, escalation is not good. We all understand that. We want to avoid escalation. But the principal goal of our foreign policy cannot be prevention of escalation. If it is, we should come home. We should draw back to these shores. We shouldn't go abroad. If we don't want to, if that's our highest priority, then there's actually logically certain things should follow. Clearly, that's not the case. And there are things that have a higher priority than escalation. And I would argue that we have talked ourselves into a logical fallacy as we consider what we need to do in the region, where concern about escalation has become such a high priority that we're hesitant to take those steps that we need to take that our opponents will understand and that our friends will be reassured by. And I actually believe that if we do that, the chances of escalation are relatively low. And I also believe that had we done this sooner, months ago, we wouldn't be in the current situation we are in now, which is at the Bab el-Mandeb. We're in a crisis situation where many of the world's oil companies or shipping companies are not sending their ships through the Bab el-Mandeb, which is having a significant impact on the global economy. We could have avoided that, but by dithering, by arguing amongst ourselves, and by being we overly signaled our responses, and then our responses were frankly weak. We have created this situation when it could have been dealt with promptly, aggressively months ago.
Yeah. So you were commander of CENTCOM during some of these escalation of these attacks. And so you had to deal with this, obviously. If you don't mind my asking, you must have, I assume you argued this when you were commander at CENTCOM. How did you understand the responses you were getting, which I assume your successor is dealing with today?
I think
probably feels the same way you do, I assume, but I don't know.
I won't speak for General Corella, but I think it's a safe assumption to say that. But again, I'm not speaking for him. Yeah. I would actually go back to 2019. In the spring of 2019, I had just taken command of CENTCOM, and in the spring, we know the Iranians looked at the significant drawdown of U.S. forces across the region. And they thought the time was right to move against us more or less directly to force our ejection from the theater. And a series of Iranian attack plans became evident to us in the April-May timeframe. And we actually did some things to deter them by overt surveillance, by flow of forces into the theater. And yet, when they struck against us and shot down our RQ-4 in, I believe, July 2019, you're all familiar with the famous episode where ultimately we chose to do nothing kinetic in response. There's an example. Had we been aggressive in that response, had we hit the Iranians when the RQ-4 was shot down, it's my belief, based on my judgment, but also my knowledge of what the Iranians were thinking at the time, we might have been able to prevent the escalatory practices that followed from Iran that actually led to the death of Qasem Soleimani on the night of 2 January 2020. When that happened, we could have averted that. We could have averted a lot of the things that happened in Iraq, but our slowness to respond led us down that trail. It's almost where we are right now, and that's an important thing. And I would add just one other thing, Michael, is the Gaza situation. We tend to think a lot about that. I may be the only person who thinks this, but I do not. While the Iranians welcome what's happening in Gaza, they are the moral author of what's happening in Gaza. They supplied Hamas. That is a secondary. That's a good thing for them, but is not central to their strategy. And their strategy is a three-part thing. They want first of all to protect their theocratic regime, the mullahs. Second, they want to achieve the destruction of the state of Israel. And third, they want to eject the U.S. from the theater. So when we think about what's going on in the region, I don't believe the Iranians view the Gaza situation as central. It's part of their plan. It is not central to their plan. And I think that's a trap we need to avoid falling into when we consider the best ways to respond to Iran in the current escalatory spiral that we are in.
Okay. And I want to ask you, I got a lot of questions and I want to get to what you think we should be doing, which I'll wait a minute, but I just want to ask you one thing about this. And you mentioned 2019 and I think that you're referring to the $120 million drone that the Iranians shot down of ours that I think it was in June of 2019. And Trump at the last minute seemed to have, based on reports, called off a retaliation like a few minutes before supposedly it was supposed to happen. Is that right? Because he cited
It was
Yeah.
a little more than a few minutes. It
Yeah.
wasn't, it's popular to say, well, airplanes were in the air. No,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
it was,
Yeah.
but what happened was he was actually given bad information by members of his national security staff about the potential collateral damage that our strike would cause. We had carefully looked at it at Central Command. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs had carefully looked at it. The Secretary of Defense had carefully looked at it. We felt it would have been a very, very minor potential loss of human life. He was briefed it would be much higher. Given that bad information, I understand why he acted. He was just acting on bad information that his staff gave him. The collateral damage would have been much lower. It would have been a very proportional response, yet it would have sent a sharp signal to the Iranians that you can't do this. There are going to be costs that are going to be imposed on you if you go after our unmanned aircraft.
Well, that's it. If you don't mind, you're saying that the military, when you provide options to the commander in chief, or you send it up the chain, you say what you think the possible casualty numbers might be. You're saying that in the White House aides sometimes add their own, or they override what the military says, or they'll say, well, this is what the military says, this is what we think it could be.
So in a nutshell, yes, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I would argue that, at Central Command, we have an elaborate system for modeling casualties. We've been doing it for many years. It's very good. And I have expert legal opinion that's available to me here to talk about proportionality, to ensure we're compliant with the law of armed conflict and other things that, we fight as a values-based organization. So we don't want to cause unnecessary casualties as we go after the objective. So what goes up from Central Command in these kinds of cases is a fully set up package. Then it's looked at by the Joint Staff, by the Secretary. They can modify, and the Secretary can modify it as he wishes, and as he should if he disagrees with it. And then it goes across what we would say it goes across the river. And the National Security Staff takes a look at it, and they can ultimately, the president is the decision maker here for most of these things, not all of them, but for a big operation like this, he was the decision maker. He chose to take a different decision. I think his staff was wrong in the information they gave him. I think that's widely known now. But ultimately, under our system, that's the way it has to work. Ultimately, the civilian leadership gets to make a final call on this. Now, we're not talking about a back and forth in a conflict. We're talking about a large sort of standalone strike. You wouldn't do this in every case, because if you do, you'll do nothing but go to conferences and talk about targets. But in this case, that's what happened.
I see. Yeah. By the way, maybe I should say I wrote a piece, I think, in the Wall Street Journal early June of 2019, said Trump needs to confront the Iranians on the ground, or these things could escalate. And as you point out, things did escalate when they didn't retaliate, because in September 2019, the Iranians hit Apcake, one of the most sensitive energy facilities in the world, in Saudi Arabia, and we didn't retaliate at all for that either. Either did the Saudis, for that matter. But and things got a lot worse. Yeah.
In cases like this, in cases where you're dealing with a tyrant, where you're dealing with a terrorist organization, where you're dealing with any kind of totalitarian regime or entity, early action is usually better. Early action. And the other thing is, you want to demonstrate capability, and you want to show that you're willing to use it. The goal of deterring someone is to produce cognitive doubt in their mind that the gain they seek is going to be offset by the pain that you're going to apply to them. And the Iranians, as an example, have never doubted our capabilities, but they have always doubted our will to use those capabilities. They know what will happen if we get into a large-scale conflict with them. They're going to be hurt very badly in that conflict and will be defeated. There's no doubt about that. But they doubt our willingness to actually embark on that conflict, which is why we're in the current situation where they're pursuing those three objectives I talked about, and they believe they can do it below a certain level of pain that they have arrived at through their calculation, where they believe the United States will not respond. And the decision to respond is not a military decision. That's a political decision. We all recognize that. And every president's different. Every president's going to approach it from a different perspective.
If we get on the politics in the strategic decision, I'm just curious how a American soldier on the ground, you think, would see things. We have soldiers in Syria, we have soldiers in Iraq, we have soldiers elsewhere in the region. You're a soldier, American soldier, you get attacked by these Iranian proxies, the United States does nothing. Is that something they say, well, this is what they signed up for, they're just the soldiers, is it? Or do they say, well, I wouldn't mind my leadership actually trying to protect me a little more? I mean, how do you think that affects the guy?
So what I can tell you is at the military level, and I'm talking about Central Command today, they've gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that we've done everything we can to protect our people on the ground in Syria and in Iraq and in other bases distributed across the region. And I would tell you, I'll give you a specific example dating from earlier, when the Iranians responded to the attack on Soleimani. And as you know, they responded with a massive missile, well, not massive, but over 10 missiles aimed at al-Assad. We were able to avoid deaths by repositioning forces sort of at the last minute. That was done by commanders on the ground. And while we did have a number of cases of mild traumatic brain injury, and I don't want to discount or minimize that, nonetheless, we were able to protect our people there to a large degree. So I would say, here's the problem, though, and what's happened over the last year with all these attacks, and this is now Frank McKenzie's opinion, we're playing above the mean right now in terms of our ability to prevent the Iranians from running with scissors and hurting someone because we're that good. But the fact of the matter is the battlefield always reverts to the mean. And sooner or later, there will be loss of life, U.S. loss of life, if these attacks continue. No matter how good you are, the battlefield operates under its own iron calculus. And, there's the province of chance and danger, as Clausewitz would say. And that's where, despite your best efforts, sometimes you're going to take casualties. Now you're in a position where the president's options are very circumscribed. If there's been significant loss of civilian or military life as a result of this, you want to avoid getting to that stage by acting promptly. And when you don't act promptly, you get into the situation that we've got right now where we're on the verge of some very dangerous things occurring.
Do you think, I'm curious how you assess how the Trump administration or how the Biden administration is different in the Trump administration on how they've approached this. But if you take a longer view, it seems like since Reagan, the U.S. has generally been afraid. I should say Reagan did sink about half the Iranian fleet, and that did help end the Iran-Iraq war. But, when we were hit by in Iran and the Marine barracks bombing, which obviously much better than I do, we didn't really do anything. And there've been a lot of occasions where we could have retaliated, and we didn't. And it always seems like we self-deter with the Iranians, no matter it's a Republican or Democratic administration. I don't know. How do you assess? Yeah.
So great point. And so, very few people are aware of that object lesson you just cited, which is the lack of effective response when the Marines were hit in October 1983 in Lebanon. Believe me, everybody in the Middle East knows that example well. Yeah. It's only us that forget it. They know that history, and they know history going back hundreds and thousands of years before then, that we, being Americans, tend to view everything in the light of what General Mattis used to call historical presentism, where it only matters what happened now. When we look at the problem bright-eyed and bushy-tailed for the first time, well, these problems don't admit solutions like that. They're far more complex and in-depth. And so that's why I think we often do ourselves an injustice when we fail to appreciate the history and the complexity of the region. Look, I would just say one other point. Iran is an imperial power dating back thousands of years. Iran is not going to go away. We have to recognize that. It's possible this theocratic government will go away, but Iran as an economic engine and as an entity in that region is going to be around. And we need to think in those terms. Most Americans, when they think of Iran, they think of the hostages. The hostage situation, that's the beginning of time for the U.S.-Iranian relationship. Well, no, you need to go back. You need to look at the counter coup that brought the Shah in the 50s. And then you need to look even further back beyond that. But we have a history with Iran. The Iranians know and understand this. All too often, we do not know and understand or appreciate that. And I think we need to do that and accept that kind of nuance when we deal with the Iranians.
All right, so let me ask you some specifics. And what do you think, given what's going on today in the Straits of the Yemen, everywhere in the region? What would you like to see the U.S. do to change the dynamics of what's going on between the United States and Iran?
Sure, Mike. Yeah, let me just set a little bit of background for that for 1 second. So, what the interesting thing about the Israeli operation in Gaza, aside from the operation itself, which we can talk about separately, is what's not happening. The Iranians are not attacking Israel and are not coming to the aid of Hamas. That's interesting. Yeah. The Lebanese Hezbollah is not, although that I was confident that would not happen days ago, I'm still fairly confident that LH, that Nasrallah doesn't want to come into this fight. So what's not happening is very important. Now, the Houthis are in the fight, but here's the thing. The Houthis have a very limited capability to do anything to Israel. They can launch onesies and twosies, which the Israelis are going to easily intercept. They can't gain the volume of fires. But what the Houthis can do, of course, is disrupt shipping in the Red Sea and in the vital choke point of the Bab el-Mandeb with their cruise missiles, with their short-range ballistic missiles, and with their unmanned aerial systems. And they are doing that and trying to do that very hard. So we need to understand that's sort of the background. Now, on top of that, and as I've already noted, Iran is carrying out a policy aimed at us, the United States, not necessarily at Israel. The policy of ejecting us in the region. So the attacks that have occurred against U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria, which, as you noted, Michael, occurred long before 7 October, have ramped up since 7 October. Again, Frank McKenzie's opinion, we would be wrong to view those as solely or even principally, primarily motivated by what's going on in Gaza. It may be useful for them to talk about it, but they are pursuing a policy of ejecting the United States from the region and a policy of the destruction of the state of Israel too. But I think we need to consider that when we look at what's going on. So now, with that said, let's talk about Yemen for just a minute and the Houthis. So the Houthis are sustained by Iran. As you know, there's been a terrible humanitarian disaster in Yemen. A lot of countries have sent a lot of food there. A country that has never sent a bag of rice there is Iran. But they have sent lots of weapons. They've sent lots of weapons and lots of weapons components. And the Houthis, and I speak with some knowledge of this, they are actually very good aeronautical engineers. They can build good systems. It's sort of shade tree mechanic work, but they can do it. I mean, they built a loitering SAM. They do very good work on the systems they get from Iran. But make no mistake, they are 100% supplied by Iran. So Iran has the luxury of really fighting what I would call a hidden hand operation with very few Iranians on the ground, Quds Force people on the ground. They're able to launch. First of all, they fought a major war, really, against Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and now they're choking world shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb at a very low price for Iran. So my view is this: the Iranians view that as a good operation, not vital to them. If we were to strike the Houthis, it is my judgment that Iran would not respond. Iran would not respond to that. The Houthis would respond within their capabilities, but it would be geographically circumscribed. What needs to happen now is 3 months ago, had we been aggressive when the Houthis started this at a low order scale, we could have launched small attack. I now think we need to do something larger in Yemen. What that would be, I have no idea. But I think we need to demonstrate to them that, if you guys really want to go up the escalation ladder here, we can make it very painful for you. And I do not believe the escalation ladder leads out of Yemen. I believe it stays in Yemen, and I believe Iran will leave their partners down there, their proxies down there, to their fate should that happen.
So let me add, it seems like we've been, and by the way, we've put together this coalition, of which Bahrain, I may add, is actually a public partner of. We've warned of consequences. I think that was the term. Didn't say what kind of consequence, but did say consequence. So far, all I'm seeing is shooting down. We haven't really done anything, whether it's knocking out facilities. I mean, but I assume you're talking about doing things in Yemen against Houthis that are going to send a strong signal. There's going to be a severe cost to them for keep doing this. So we don't just play defense. Right?
Michael, you're exactly right. I mean, shooting at boats that are attacking you and shooting at missiles, that's the retail level operation. You've got to go wholesale if you want to have effect here. You've got to do something that causes them pain. And that means you've got to strike targets in Yemen that are important to the Houthis. Look, I'm sure we know where those targets are. We got great target decks on them. And that would be clearly what I would recommend doing. And I think, I believe that could be you'll get into an escalatory spiral with the Houthis. Could be there'll be a back and forth as a result of that. But I believe, Michael, that it would be limited. It would be limited to that region. I don't think you'd see the Iranians launch against Israel with the 100 or so missiles that they could fire at Israel, or do something significant against our forces there, or Lebanese Hezbollah come in. I believe that's a separate little theater where there'll be room to operate.
I mean, are you encouraged that it seems like some of these missiles have been fired? They've also fired, if I'm not mistaken, at Israel. Israel has shot down some, but there have been reports that the Saudis have too, because these missiles went over their airspace. Do you see emerging almost a de facto or more a regional air shield that, we and others, you guys have been discussing for a number of years, emerging already now?
So Michael, I believe that the one thing all those nations in the region fear is they fear Iran. And when they fear Iran, of course, they fear their proxies. But what they really fear are the air and missile capabilities that Iran brings to the fight. A major war in the region is going to be a fires war with weapons that are delivered by missiles, by cruise missiles, and by UASs, unmanned aerial systems. And therefore, there's a compelling argument for nations in the region to knit their warning systems together and to talk to each other about the Iranian threat. And I would tell you, Michael, furthermore, but before I gave up command, I was able to host 2 chief of defense conferences where we had not all, but most of the chiefs of defense of the region together, including Israel. And we had an opportunity to talk about that threat. And so here's the thing about air defense, air and missile defense. In the region, as you know, there are significant concerns about sovereignty, giving up sovereignty. The beauty of air and missile defense work is you don't have to give up sovereignty. What you are generally sharing is information, which still can be hard to share. But what you're trying to do is build what we call a common operational picture. Everybody sees the threat. Warnings are passed so that, for example, if the Houthis are launching against Israel, Saudi Arabia, and I have no personal direct knowledge of this, Saudi Arabia could either intercept or pass a warning to Israel or talk to our ships out in the Red Sea. The same with us, but what you try to do is knit it all together. And that is the secret sauce, if you will, of coalition warfare. It's the unique convening authority that the United States brings. But what I also think it means is with Israel coming into the Central Command region, it creates is the operationalization really of the Abraham Accords that allows you to think about how you might actually achieve an operational linkage with the forces and the capabilities that Israel brings to the fight. And we know in the air and missile defense regime, they are unsurpassed. And every country in the region knows that.
Yeah. I just mentioned for the audience, and because we talked about this before, but actually JINSA put out a report 2 years ago called Build It, and They Were Come, actually about trying to facilitate I think help mandate they got that actually turned into legislation that was in the National Defense Authorization Act and mandated a Pentagon strategy for building a regional air defense shield. And I think it's really something to see. It seems like it's actually starting to come together right now in maybe de facto. It seems like based on reports that we're getting. Let me ask you, General, and I want to get back to the retaliation issue, but one of the ways we did seem to escalate our retaliation, because a lot of it seems like U.S. retaliations against Iranian proxies have been focused on facilities and not haven't really killed many of the folks involved that are attacking their forces. We did recently kill a leader of an Iraqi popular mobilization force. And in downtown Baghdad, I think it was last week. And I wonder, and then, the Baghdad government reacted, condemned us, and to kick us out. We've always, what I've gathered, and I'd be curious if you could explain this, what we've heard before is that one of the reasons in recent years, and this is Trump or Biden, it didn't matter, that there's some folks in the military have been hesitant about retaliating against attacks on our forces has been that we're worried, or has been worried that how the Iranians and their proxies will attack other forces of ours in the region. And you wonder sometimes, and I'm not advocating this, I'm just asking, do you think that we have about 3,500 troops in Iraq? I think we have under 900, I think, in Syria. I mean, you would know the numbers. I thought it's like 500 and 900 in Syria. If we're always going to be so worried about how the Iranians and their proxies are going to hit our forces, do there become questions of the effectiveness of the presence of our forces in some of these areas? Are they more liabilities than assets if we're going to be so nervous about Iranian retaliations at our forces? Sorry for that long question. And I think that question knocked off General McKenzie. So I will wait for him to jump back online while he's thinking of an answer. Okay, it seems like his Wi-Fi probably went down on his office. Okay. Okay, we got General back. Okay. General, we got you back soon?
Michael,
All right. We hear you a little. We don't see you, but we hear you.
I'm going to go ahead and start responding to your question then.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm sorry, it's a little garbled. It's probably bad internet down here in Tampa.
I'm sure. Yeah, CENTCOM is interfering with our.
Look, so here's the thing: as we look at what the Iranians can strike in Iraq and Syria, you're right, 2,500 or so people in Iraq, about 900 or so people in Syria, distributed bases, easiest thing for them to get to. We always thought that if they're attacking us in Iraq and in Syria, you didn't want to strike back in Iraq unless you had to, because it would further pressurize the Iraqi government and lead to a situation that we've got now where they're talking about kicking us out. Look, they talked about kicking us out after the strike on Soleimani. In fact, Parliament passed a resolution. We're still there some years later. So I don't know that, and as you know, the way things are done in Iraq, they could be talking about this 30 years from now. So that doesn't particularly worry me. But I do think that it's important. So it's important to select targets that cause pain to the opponent. And sometimes those are personality targets that you need to strike instead of empty buildings. However, because this is ultimately a political decision in the United States, if no casualties are accrued on our side, there's often hesitancy to approve targets that could cause loss of life on the other side, personality-driven targets, for example. That's sort of the dilemma. That's sort of the dilemma that we're in. I would argue that sometimes you do want to go up a step, say, hey, look, you guys need to knock it off. And you need to knock it off right now. And we're going to hurt you a little bit to show you that we can do that. And that should be something that sort of guide that I would, if I were arguing that, and I have argued it in the past, that's how we should craft our response to that. I mean, we are the power with significant military capabilities. We shouldn't be afraid to display that power, to shape our objectives.
Okay. Okay, let me ask about Iran. This is an issue that comes up in Israel. Now, the Israelis have not been afraid of retaliating against Iran. They also had their own recent strikes. They just killed it's been highly reported, but everyone assumes Israel. They haven't officially taken credit, but killing a senior Hamas leader who was basically their chief of their liaison a lot with other forces in the region, Aruri, and in Beirut. There's been questions in Israel. This has come up, I know. Should Israel always be hitting back proxies, or should they hit back on inside the Iran? And the issue sometimes is framed as, do you hit the head of the octopus, or you just keep going at the tentacles? And I wonder how you look at that. At some point, I mean, this is a massive disparity of attacks on us versus how we retaliate. And as you clearly point out in your op-ed and what you're saying now, we're more self-deterred than deterring them. Is there a point where we need to hit back inside Iran and not go just after the proxies in Yemen or Iraq or elsewhere?
So you need to recognize that if you strike Iran, you're crossing a red line. It will be a different thing that the United States, has not done in the past, and would probably take it to a new level. I would argue there are other things you can strike that's important to Iran that don't involve going what I would call metropolitan Iran, going into the landmass of Iran itself, and we should consider those. Look, in terms of what Israel has done with the strikes against the Hamas leader and then the Hezbollah leader, of course, in southern Lebanon. In the case of the Hamas leader, I don't believe. Again, my opinion, others can view it differently. I don't believe that is viewed as escalatory by anyone. I don't think Lebanese Hezbollah is concerned about that. Now, they are concerned that they struck the Hezbollah commander, and that might lead to a tit for tat of escalation. But I believe in the case of Lebanese Hezbollah, Nasrallah is going to make a cold, clear-eyed strategic decision if he wants to attack Israel, because he knows the massive pain that Israel can inflict upon him. Additionally, Lebanese Hezbollah, politically and economically, is weakened in Lebanon. This is not 2006. This is a time when the death spiral of the Lebanese economy, the complete gridlock of the Lebanese political system, all do in fact reflect to some degree on Lebanese Hezbollah, and he's aware of that. So he's got to walk a very careful path here. Look, is he still inimical to Israel in the long term? Of course he is, but he is not necessarily going to come into this fight. Certainly not because there's problems in Gaza, and probably not because the Iranians say do it, because he could be destroyed and Iran not hurt. He's not going to be an Iranian cat's paw here. He will make an independent decision. Having said that, of course, he's generally aligned with the goals of Iran here. So I just think we need to consider that as we think about, decisions that we might make on escalation. Now, Israel, look, I think they'll strike Hamas targets wherever they are in the world. I think wherever they can find an appropriate target, and by that I mean at the high level political and military echelon, I'm confident Israel will probably go after them wherever they are and under whatever circumstances they can find them. But I think Israel too would think twice about doing something large and not deniable, inside Iran. Look, Iranian nuclear scientist killed a couple of years ago. It probably wasn't the Dutch that did that. And everybody knows that. But again, there's a veneer of deniability there, and that's important. But something that was strictly that would be undeniable, I think that Iran would probably be compelled to respond. Now, how they can respond? Actually, they don't have a lot of good options against Israel. They got to, if they're going to hurt Israel, they've got to convince Lebanese Hezbollah to come into the fight. I believe they can hurt Israel. Although LH would be badly hurt when the war is over, they can hurt Israel. Iran's ability to hurt Israel is more than the Houthis, but it's also limited. Whereas LH has capabilities much closer to home.
Let me ask you a little more on that, and I want to ask you about Gaza. Look, there's been this back and forth, obviously, between Israel, Hezbollah, as you're referring to. I have thought, and I think it sounds like you do, that Hezbollah would prefer, and the Iranians prefer not to have a war with Israel right now. However, something could change. God forbid one of these missiles that Hezbollah fires hits a school in Israel or who knows what, then all bets are off. I think if you have and I think Israel is going to, my sense is that Israel is going to have to, they've tried having, let's say, genocidal Islamist terrorist organization backed by Iran living a few hundred meters from their towns, and that didn't work so well in the south. And I think they have a different approach about the north. At some point, it seems to me this Hezbollah issue is going to have to be dealt with, whether it's now or later. Let's say, for the sake of argument, there is a war between Israel and Hezbollah, and they got, I don't know, 150,000 or 200,000 rockets versus what Hamas had, about 20,000. They have a few hundred precision-guided missiles and so on. So it's going to be a different kind of war. What would you think the role of the U.S. would be if there's what it should be if there's a war between Israel and Hezbollah?
Well, if there's an overt war and Israel were stressed, I believe we would assist in the defense of Israel. I'm just speaking for myself now, but I believe that we would assist in the defense of Israel. I don't know that we'll be doing offensive things. That would be a policy decision. But the cruisers and destroyers that we brought into the Eastern Med, those ships are principally valuable because of their air defense radars, which can look deep into Israel, deep into Lebanon, and can work against missiles. Really, though, they're better suited for missiles coming from Iran, and that's why we have them there to take a look at that. So there are things that we could do to help Israel, and I'm sure we would. Look, a large-scale intervention by Lebanese Hezbollah while the war in Gaza is ongoing, I think is the worst-case scenario for the state of Israel. You do not want that to happen. I think Israel would be stressed to be successful there. I believe they would be successful, but there would be a lot of casualties. There would be a lot of infrastructure destruction in Israel because just the simple volume of LH missiles is going to stress Iron Dome. It's going to stress David Sling. It's going to stress all of your capabilities. Plus, now you're fighting a multi-axis attack. You know, you got to fight up north. You got to fight down south. And also, you would, if LH comes in, you might think Iran would come in too. So now you're really in a real multi-axis attack, and that's your worst case scenario. That's why, from my perspective, if I were Israel, I would go to great lengths to avoid fighting with LH. I don't say go up there and schwack a Hamas commander if you see him, or a Hamas diplomat up there, or do other action and the little tit for tat that we're seeing going back and forth. Now, I do take your point that the economic situation that this is caused by the evacuation of people up north may create something that is unsustainable for Israel. And that might require to recalculate. But, even Nasrallah in his recent speech, I think most analysts believe he opened the door to some kind of an agreement up north. Look, and I'm not one of these guys who reads, when petty tyrants across the region say something, I glom onto it and say, peace is here at our time. I've learned the hard way. That's usually not the case. But I do believe that there might be something there. Yeah. Nasrallah is going to make a calculation based on what's best for LH, not what's best for Iran. And so we should remember that.
So, and by the way, I think, it was a debate after October 7th in Israel. It seemed like at senior levels whether Israel should go north, with the ground incursion. There were reports that some of the military leaders, including defense minister, want to do that. Israel obviously decided not to do it. And I think what you said is what they're thinking. And obviously our colleague, who I know you spent time with in Israel, General Yaakov Amidjor, who's former Israel, was emphatic on our webinar on 2 days after the war, on October 9th, 2 days after the attack. Israel has to go south and take care of Hamas. And I think that's where they are. So let's talk about Gaza. How do you assess how that war is going? There obviously, the president, Biden, was very supportive of Israel, but you have the Secretary of State Blinken, who'd been there in the region now, and then there've been a lot of talks. I mean, President Biden once used the term indiscriminate bombing once, although I think the White House kind of walked that back a little, but there's a lot of pressure on them to move to a new phase. And it seems like in northern Gaza, they've already moved a bit more to this lower intensity phase. And I may add, just for the audience, every Thursday afternoon, we have a webinar with General Amidjor, and also one or two of our other Israeli generals who are fellow, General Yaakov Aish and General Norkin, former J3 and former Air Force commander in Israel. So I encourage everybody to listen in about where the war is tomorrow, which was on Thursday. But how do you assess it, General McKenzie, how Israel is doing and how what's going on? What do you think the U.S. should be doing or not doing right now on it?
So when I look at the Gaza war, I think in terms of 5 things, and 5 Israeli objectives writ large. The first objective is the obvious one. As they've said, they're going in to dismantle Hamas politically and militarily and prevent them from being a factor in the future. I think they're at best partially along to that goal. I think a lot of Hamas light infantry has died. I think the Hamas high level chain of command is still largely intact at the military and the political echelon. So they've got work to do there. It's going slow because Hamas is fighting a very smart campaign. We all know how they've embedded in the population. They're living underground. They're falling back. They're making it very difficult and slow for the Israelis to go. So I think that is at best underway, but is nowhere near completion. I think it's going to take them a lot of time to finish that. So that's number one. Number 2 is, I think Israel actually does want to protect the civilian population in Gaza to the best of their the best of their ability to do so. That's proven problematic because of the way Hamas has chosen to fight. And therefore, look, I'm acutely sympathetic to commanders who's got to make decisions about proportionality to go after a key target. The problem Israel has on the world stage is the attack of 7 October is now months in the past. And the news cycle has moved on. And the news cycle now focuses on what happens every day in Gaza. and it gets louder and louder among people who have no sense of the historical linkage between these events. So, however, I think but I got to tell you, I think Israel has also struggled with this objective. To actually be on the right side of minimizing civilian casualties. I don't know that we could have done it any better. I just know it's hard for them to do it. The third thing that Israel's objective is they want to keep their own casualties low, military casualties, and there have been significant military casualties, but I think they've done about as well as they could. And they also want to protect the Israeli population. And I think that's a win. Since 7 October, since that day, I think Hamas's ability to fire rockets into Israel has proven problematic at best for them. They've not had a lot of success there. And the Iron Dome has worked. They've been able to make the intercepts, and they've been able to prevent large-scale military casualties, although military casualties have continued to occur and will continue to occur because that's the nature of this kind of fighting. The fourth objective is the hostages. You want to get your hostages back. I think it's going to be very hard to get the remaining hostages back, Michael. That's just my opinion.
Yeah.
I think they're the last thing that Hamas has. I think, I was talking to someone yesterday who said, well, there's evidence that, they've got all the hostages around the leader down there in the south in his home city. I don't know that. Wouldn't surprise me. But in a larger sense, Hamas has actually used the entire population of Gaza as hostages. To hide behind, and that's actually law of armed conflict violation right there. They have caused this dilemma. So as I look at it, I am not optimistic that we're going to get a lot of these hostages back. That's my candid professional military assessment. The fifth thing is prevent wider escalation. And that has, up until now, generally worked pretty well. We've talked about Hezbollah. Lebanese Hezbollah has not chosen to come in. Iran has not come in. Certainly the Houthis have rattled and tried to do what they can, but it's been limited and not been effective against striking Israel. So as I look at the campaign, it's a campaign that, to me at least, is very much still in progress. And campaigns like this are nonlinear. You shouldn't assume that the progress of the last 10 days are going to be the progress of the next 10 days. A big event could occur, positive or negative, that could completely change the complexion of the operation on the ground. And I believe that's something that, the newspaper guys and the media that look at it, all they see is the trend line. Well, the trend line can change pretty dramatically. If you get a key leader, if you discover this, or if you have a setback yourself, those are all inherent to the battlefield, the random nature, chance and danger of the province of the battlefield. You just have to bear that in mind as you take a look at what's happening there. So look, they've done a lot of good work. There's a lot of hard work still left ahead. You asked me to talk about the U.S. support. So I think one thing the U.S. can do and has done is we have tried to prevent the war from spreading. And I think largely we've been effective at that. An obvious show of force in the region has cooled Iran down. Iran behaves differently when there's an aircraft carrier in the region and they know that carrier is there. Iran behaves differently when we bring ships in, more aircraft squadrons in. They understand the capabilities those forces bring. So I think we've been very effective at that. The last observation I would just have is this. It's just an objective evaluation. Time, I believe, is not on Israel's side here. Because of world opinion, because of the tyranny of the news cycle that we've already discussed, and the fact that this is not a campaign that's going to be on a timeline. It's not a campaign that's going to take it's going to take time to do it. You're in a period. You're finishing a period of significant urban maneuver, and now you're entering a period of, as I understand the strategy, you're entering a period of focused counterinsurgency, where you're going to ramp down these big attacks, but you're still going to be doing attacks. People are still going to be losing their lives. You're still going to be going after one of the most elaborate tunnel networks in the world, maybe the most elaborate tunnel network in the world, except for the Moscow subway system. And that's going to be a hard thing to get after. So, I watch closely, and I know that. And the last thing would be, Michael, it's just my personal observation. I would like to have a better understanding of what the end state's going to be.
Yes.
What's it going to look like? And I think if Israel can clarify that would actually buy them more time, buy them greater political support in the United States. The one thing I know about the end state that I would be 100% for is Hamas can have no role in that end state, no role. But beyond that, I think you need to think pretty imaginatively about what that could look like at the end. And without that, you're just fighting a campaign without a political objective. And the objective has to be more than removing the political and military echelons of Hamas. I'll pause there.
No, thanks. And by the way, on that issue, I should say that JINSA is, we partner with another group called the Vandenberg Coalition, and actually we have a group on this issue that's going to be putting out something, at least our recommendations for the day after the way forward in Gaza. And the group has been out to the region just again over the weekend, and went out last month, and been in touch with senior officials on both sides. Well, both there and here, among many experts. So I tell people, stay tuned for our release on that. But let me ask you a couple quick things, because I know our time is running short. I have a couple questions that people have asked that I want to get to. Before that, you mentioned the aircraft carriers. And I know we have very few that we're able, there's only so many places, there's only so many of them that we could deploy. We had two in the region. We just believe we withdrew one. I realize that there are other commitments for these carriers, among other considerations of maintenance and things. Is that important that one left? Would it have been better to try to extend it? How do you see that?
It would have been better to have two.
Yeah.
I'm now I'm speaking as a CENTCOM commander.
Yeah.
But there's CENTCOM fatigue in Washington. People don't want to study war no more in the Middle East. It's more fun to play against China, and the Navy, frankly, has significant trouble generating aircraft carriers for a lot of reasons that are beyond the scope of this discussion. But I will tell you this: posture matters. Posture matters in achieving deterrence. Iran knows and understands what our posture is, and they know when it goes up and they know when it goes down.
Okay. Let me ask you, got a couple questions in the one, there are two questions of somewhat similar, one by Jay Solomon, a reporter. Do you think the Arab states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Egypt will get behind strikes against the Houthis? So far, they seem to be against it. And then relatedly, my colleague John Hanna has a question. He says, are you worried that the Houthis would respond if we attack the Houthis in Yemen? Would the Houthis respond by attacking the Saudis and or the Emiratis? There has been reporting that the Saudis are urging us not to escalate with Houthis because they're negotiating a permanent ceasefire. How should we think about those issues, and how do we balance the concerns of our key partners?
Sure. So first of all, I would assume we're in significant talks with both UAE and Saudi Arabia about what's going on in the Bab el-Mandeb. It's to no one's benefit that the Bab el-Mandeb be closed, not to UAE's benefit, not to Saudi Arabia's benefit. They're the closest to they're very close to Yemen, and they understand what the Houthis are capable of. I would think and hope that we are consulting with those partners, but I believe we need to act, and it would be best to have a unified front. What you might get, as you often get in the region, is silence rather than objection. And as you know, that often happens. But the Houthis are at a point now where if we do not take action, the problem is going to metastasize. It's going to get worse. And typically appeasement is not an effective long-term solution, as we know from a lot of examples from recent and less recent history.
Yeah. By the way, have you been impressed that the Bahrainis have actually been more out in front than some of our other Arab partners in the Gulf?
I have always been impressed by the Kingdom of Bahrain's leadership and His Majesty's willingness to make a decision and to be with us. I've had the opportunity to spend some time with him and the Crown Prince, and they are genuine leaders. When the King makes a decision, they'll act and act immediately. They did that in joining the International Maritime Security Construct in the fall of 2019, I believe, when we were looking for members. And His Majesty made I was at dinner with His Majesty. He made the decision to do it, dispatched the foreign minister from the room, and they joined that night. Literally, it was an example of rapid decision making, rapid execution. Bahrain has been a good friend of the United States, and as you know, our main naval base, our main operating base, actually in the region, is at Manama in Bahrain, and they've been good, loyal friends for many years.
Mm-hmm. One last question before I want to ask you about your book before we and is I think that there's a chance at some point we'll see whether there could be a resumption of there was a lot of momentum for a Saudi-Israel normalization before. It's been assumed that there should be some security arrangement between the United States, like a mutual defense treaty between Saudi Arabia and the United States as part of that. What would you think of that, by the way, if we had a mutual defense treaty with us and the Saudis, help facilitate also a peace agreement with Israel and Saudi?
So, first of all, I think normalization between those two nations is going to continue. Whatever happens here in Gaza, I think it's going to continue because I think Saudi is very concerned about Iran. And to deal effectively with Iran, they need to have a good working relationship with Israel. And they recognize that. I think UAE recognizes that as well. So certainly there's going to be posturing, there's going to be messaging over what's going on in Gaza. But I believe in the long arc of the trajectory relationships between these states, they will continue to grow closer. Look, the problem with a treaty is you're going to have to get Senate, you have to get 67 votes in the U.S. Senate.
Yeah.
And that's going to be tough. Just for a lot of reasons, it's going to be tough. Otherwise, and they know this, that any agreement's not worth the paper it's written on because the next president can abrogate it. You can say, well, we're going to do this, but unless it's a treaty and the U.S. is bound to it, it's very hard to make it stick. So I understand why the Saudis want that. I just think from a practical political perspective, it is difficult to do. It may not be impossible to do, but it's going to be very difficult to do.
Okay. One last thing. So with the 3 minutes left, you want to say something about your book? And I'm going to ask you and put you on the spot in front of everyone. I hope when your book comes out, we could do another webinar for you to discuss it at length. But
I'll be delighted to do another webinar, either for the book or before then even.
Yeah,
so, Michael, the book is entitled The Melting Point, High Command and War in the 21st Century. And the title of the book is actually taken from Barbara Tuchman's great popular history of the beginning of World War I, The Guns of August. And she has a line in there, that melting point of warfare, the temperament of the individual commander. And so my perspective in the book is about the perspective of an individual commander. At 3 years at U.S. Central Command, what I learned, what I knew. So I talk about that. I talk about in some detail about operations that we undertook, how we tried to achieve deterrence against Iran, how the headquarters was organized. But there's some other themes in the book as well. And a critical theme in the book, and it's one that's very important to me, is the importance of civ-mil relations and the importance of civilian supremacy in that relationship. And I would argue that on a couple of occasions, I argued for a decision. I didn't get what I wanted. At that point, it was my job to salute and execute the orders I was given. They were lawful orders. I felt they were wrong, but it's time to do what I swore to do, to uphold the Constitution. So I spent a little bit of time talking about that. And but really, it's sort of my view of what it meant to be a four-star general at a pretty turbulent time in our nation and in the world. Because as a combatant commander, you really live at the nexus of operations, of strategy, of policy, and of course, politics as well. As Winston Churchill said, at the very top, at the very apex, you're being foolish if you don't believe that practical politics have an effect on strategic decisions. And I believe that that's not just true the last 4 or 5 years, but true all the way back throughout U.S. history, from Abraham Lincoln and the war between the states, 1862 and 1864 elections and decisions he had to make there, to FDR's decisions on torch in the fall of 1942 to try to get an invasion in before the midterm election. These are not new things. And when we just talk about them as if these are suddenly new and horrifying things, we do a disservice to our understanding of American history and our understanding of what civ-mil relations are.
Look, first of all, I appreciate your bringing in Churchill, my own personal interest in that subject. And I want to thank you very much for all the time you just spent with us explaining this. I know we had a big audience. We have a lot of retired military folks, including some former commandants of the Marine Corps that signed up and to listen to you and other folks. And I really appreciate your joining us and all your outstanding service to our country. And thank you very much.
Michael, thank you. GENS is a great organization. I really appreciated the opportunity to go to Israel last year. Of all the generals that went, I was probably the one that least needed the experience of going back to Israel because I'd dealt with them so much, but I never pass up the opportunity to visit Israel. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. All right. Thanks a lot. We'll look forward to
Take care, my friend. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.